When Union soldiers forced open the rusted iron doors of a forgotten plantation basement in Georgia, they didn't expect to find children, 23 of them, locked away in the dark. Each bore the same eerie features: pale green eyes, auburn hair, and the high cheekbones of the same woman, their mistress. That discovery, buried in military archives for over a century, exposed one of the most horrifying secrets of America's slave past. Because these children weren't just victims of slavery, they were the results of a twisted experiment in human breeding, conceived and controlled by a woman who believed she could engineer loyalty through blood. This is the true story of Katherine Thornhill, the widow who built her legacy in bondage, and the nightmare that ended with her vanishing from history. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover the parts of history they don't teach in school, the stories buried in courthouse basements and forgotten letters. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Are you anywhere near Burke County, Georgia? Because who knows? The past we're about to uncover might not be as far away as you think. When Union troops marched into Burke County, Georgia, in the final months of the Civil War, they expected the usual sights of Southern defeat: abandoned plantations, empty fields, and scattered families of freed people emerging from bondage. What they did not expect was the silence that poured out from beneath the earth at Thornhill Estate. The house itself was half-ruined, its white brick walls stained with smoke, its iron gates hanging open like broken ribs. But when the soldiers pried open the heavy cellar doors, rusted shut from years of neglect, they found a scene that made hardened men drop their rifles. Huddled in the darkness were 23 children, some no older than 4, others approaching their teenage years. Their skin was pale, their eyes an otherworldly green, and their hair shimmered with auburn and gold. Every single face seemed to carry the same unmistakable features, as if stamped from the same mold. At first, the soldiers thought these were kidnapped children, perhaps orphans taken during the chaos of war. But the eldest, a trembling girl of 13, whispered something that would later be written down in a confidential military report. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." Those words chilled the officers more than the damp air in that cellar ever could. The children were malnourished but alive, their wrists marked by iron restraints. Some cried when the light touched their faces, others stared blankly as if they had never seen the sun. In the stunned silence that followed, no one could yet imagine what kind of woman would lock her own offspring beneath her home, or why. The official records of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry mention Thornhill Estate only once, buried in a confidential letter filed away for more than a century. Local histories of Burke County pretend the plantation never existed. Yet every soldier present that day carried the memory of what they saw. The eerie resemblance among the children, the absence of any adults, and the strange symbols carved into the cellar beams, markings that later scholars would interpret as Katherine Thornhill's personal cipher. In time, those children would vanish into the confusion of Reconstruction, scattered across Georgia and beyond, their origins whispered only in fragments. But the mystery of who had created them, and why, would fester like an open wound beneath the surface of Southern memory. Only years later would researchers uncover fragments of the truth: old court ledgers, coded journals, and forgotten correspondence pointing to a plantation mistress who called herself a cultivator of generations. Katherine Thornhill wasn't remembered for cotton or wealth. She was remembered for the horror she built behind the facade of refinement. She believed she could design loyalty through blood, crafting a workforce that would never rebel because it was bound to her by birth. Her vision wasn't just monstrous, it was methodical. And when the Union soldiers freed those 23 children in 1864, they didn't merely open a cellar, they exposed one of the darkest experiments in American history. The story of Katherine Thornhill begins not with madness, but with desperation. In February of 1847, the red clay hills of Burke County lay frozen under a rare Georgia winter. That same month, the Thornhill Estate, once 1,700 acres of thriving cotton, fell silent. Its master, Jonathan Thornhill, had died of fever, leaving behind nothing but debt, a failing plantation, and a 28-year-old widow who refused to accept ruin. Katherine Danforth Thornhill had grown up in privilege, the educated daughter of a wealthy Augusta merchant, but privilege was a fragile shield in the post-cotton slump. Now, as creditors circled and workers whispered about being sold off, Katherine found herself standing alone in a house that was literally falling apart, staring out over fields too exhausted to produce and a life slipping through her fingers. In the months after her husband's death, the young widow met with lawyers, estate agents, and anyone who might offer a way out. The answer was always the same: sell the land, sell the workers, and return to your father's home in Augusta. But that, to Katherine, was unthinkable. She would not live as a dependent spinster under her father's roof, a quiet humiliation among the tea tables of Southern society. She had been raised to manage wealth, not to surrender it. So she began searching for a way to resurrect Thornhill on her own terms. Night after night, she sat by candlelight in the decaying study, running her fingers down columns of numbers, until one thought, a monstrous, logical thought, began to take root. If she could not afford to buy more enslaved workers, perhaps she could create them. The notion might have seemed insane to an outsider, but to Katherine, it felt like divine ingenuity. The South had always treated enslaved people as property, breeding, buying, and selling them like livestock. Katherine merely took that existing cruelty and systematized it. What if, she reasoned, her workers were also her blood? What if their loyalty was biological, their bondage generational? She was still young enough to bear children. She would choose the strongest, healthiest enslaved men, conceive her own offspring with them, and raise those children as laborers devoted not just to the estate, but to her. It would be a new form of ownership, one that no court could dissolve and no rebellion could break. Beneath her calm exterior, Katherine began to see herself not as a widow, but as a creator, the architect of a self-sustaining empire built from her own womb. Outwardly, she remained the picture of piety, dressed in black, attending church, speaking softly of her late husband's virtues. But behind those green eyes, calculation simmered. She began keeping a coded journal, disguising her plans in agricultural metaphors. She called the men she selected rootstock and the pregnancies plantings. To her, the language of farming cloaked the language of eugenics long before that word existed. What grew from that winter of grief and pride would haunt Georgia for generations. Katherine Thornhill, the lonely widow of Burke County, had found her purpose, and she would pursue it with a ruthlessness that made even the cruelest plantation masters look ordinary. The plan took shape quietly, like frost creeping over glass, slow, deliberate, and impossible to stop once it began. In the spring of 1847, Thornhill Estate stood on the brink of collapse. Its fields were thin with weeds, its barns nearly empty, its enslaved population reduced to barely 31 people. But in Katherine Thornhill's mind, a new kind of prosperity was taking root, one not built on cotton, but on blood. She studied the men who worked her land with the eye of a breeder assessing stock, their strength, their posture, the steadiness of their hands. When her gaze lingered on Isaac, a 24-year-old born on the property, she saw not a human being, but the foundation of her experiment. That March, she summoned him to the main house after nightfall. What passed between them was recorded in her journal with chilling precision. First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. To Katherine, this was not sin, it was strategy. She believed herself a visionary, rescuing the estate through controlled creation. She documented everything: timing, physical traits, even temperament. Her detached notes read like a scientist's ledger, not a woman's confession. When she realized she was pregnant, she wrote simply, "Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. There was no joy, no shame, only satisfaction. In her mind, she was crafting a legacy that would endure beyond the reach of markets or war. The others on the plantation noticed her strange seclusion, her late-night meetings, her sudden interest in the health of particular men and women. Whispers spread, but fear kept tongues still. Even the enslaved people who suspected her intentions couldn't have guessed the full horror of what she was engineering. But someone else was watching closely, her 16-year-old stepson, Richard Thornhill. Richard had never trusted Katherine, not since she married his father years earlier. He saw how she hid her account books, how she met with the midwife in hushed tones, and how she dismissed the house servants who once attended her daily. When he overheard Katherine scheduling visits with Miriam Grayson, the local midwife known for her silence, he grew suspicious. His father had died months before, yet Katherine claimed to be pregnant with his child. The timing was impossible. Late one night, Richard crept into her study and found a locked drawer containing a leather-bound journal written in cipher. It took him days to decode it, and when he did, the truth shattered him. Katherine wasn't carrying his father's heir. She was carrying the child of an enslaved man, and worse, she was planning to do it again and again. Richard copied several pages, trembling as he read about her breeding program. He planned to expose her, to tell her lawyer, maybe even his grandfather in Augusta. But Katherine was already 2 steps ahead. She discovered his intrusion, confronted him with icy calm, and made sure he understood what disobedience meant. Soon after, Richard fell mysteriously ill. Weakness, stomach pains, confusion. The midwife diagnosed consumption, but the servants whispered of poison. By December 1847, Richard was dead. 3 weeks later, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy and named him Jonathan, claiming he was her late husband's son, born prematurely. In truth, he was the first child of her monstrous idea, the seed of a bloodline built on ownership, deception, and cruelty disguised as genius. After Richard's death, Thornhill Estate fell under an eerie calm, the kind that hides rot beneath silence. To the neighbors, Katherine Thornhill was simply a grieving widow managing her late husband's property with surprising efficiency. She wore mourning black for a year, attended church without fail, and spoke of her beloved stepson with practiced sorrow. Yet behind the closed shutters of the great house, her ledger of sin continued to grow. The journal Richard had discovered, the same ciphered record he died trying to expose, became her most prized possession. In it, she detailed every planting, every harvest, and every adjustment to her breeding program as though she were cataloging crops rather than human lives. Each entry bore her neat, slanted handwriting, emotionless, methodical, absolute. By 1850, Thornhill had begun to change. Cotton yields improved slightly, and Katherine's reputation as a shrewd manager spread through Burke County. What few realized was that her newfound success came not from agricultural skill, but from her dark efficiency. She bore 4 more children in rapid succession, daughters Eleanor, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son, Samuel. All were fathered by different enslaved men chosen for their strength and stability. To outsiders, these births were explained away with polite fictions, orphans she had taken in, or children of distant relatives. But on the plantation, the truth was known all too well. The men she selected were summoned to the main house under threat of punishment. The women, enslaved mothers, wives, watched helplessly as their families were broken apart. And when pregnancies occurred outside Katherine's plan, they were quietly ended by the midwife, Miriam Grayson, who had traded her conscience for comfort and coin. In the quarters, fear thickened like smoke. People whispered about the mistress's experiments, though no one dared call them by name. The women she used for forced abortions stopped speaking altogether, hollowed by trauma. One, a young woman named Ruth, tried to resist. She ran for the woods one spring night, pregnant and desperate. She made it nearly 4 miles before the overseer's dogs found her. What happened afterward, her forced miscarriage, her slow decline, became one of those stories that lived only in whispers. And still Katherine wrote, unbothered. Her journals, now 2 volumes, recorded the losses as failed cultivations, the births as viable seedlings. She saw tragedy not in human cost, but in inefficiency. By the mid-1850s, Thornhill's enslaved population had nearly doubled, yet the true nature of that growth remained hidden from the world. Katherine's children, her own offspring, were raised apart from the others, clothed better, taught to read in secret, told they were special. In a twisted way they were. They were her proof of concept, the living evidence that her system worked. And in her ciphered notebooks, she began outlining the next phase, pairing her older children with the next generation she planned to breed. Her handwriting grew tighter, almost frantic, as though she could already see the future she was building. A plantation powered not by purchase or sale, but by bloodlines she controlled completely. The code that had once concealed her shame now served a different purpose. It preserved her legacy, ensuring that even if Thornhill burned, her vision would endure, in ink, in blood, and in the veins of her descendants. By 1856, the Thornhill plantation had become something almost unrecognizable, a place where silence was discipline and obedience was bred as deliberately as the crops in the field. To visitors, it seemed a rare success story in a region of struggling estates. Cotton yields were improving, the debts were shrinking, and Mistress Thornhill appeared to have restored her fortune through sheer willpower. But those who lived under her rule knew better. The prosperity growing from Thornhill's red clay was not the product of good management. It was fertilized by fear. Katherine's special children, now numbering nearly a dozen, were kept close to her in the main house, fed well, dressed neatly, and schooled in reading and writing, even as their legal status remained that of slaves. She told them they were chosen, that they were destined to carry on her heritage. In truth, they were the foundation of the next generation she intended to breed. The plantation operated under a twisted logic known only to Katherine and her accomplice, Miriam Grayson. When an enslaved woman became pregnant without Katherine's approval, the midwife was summoned. When a man showed resistance, the overseer, Virgil Kane, handled it with brutality. The pattern became routine, systematic, mechanical. The Thornhill Journal, now expanded to a 3rd volume, documented everything: physical attributes, temperament, labor output, even minor illnesses. Katherine referred to each birth as an investment matured. The language of farming and finance disguised what she truly was, a woman running a human laboratory in the guise of a plantation. Every cry in the night, every forced pairing, every broken family became a data point in her ledger. And still, she managed to hide it all behind that veneer of Southern gentility. Among the enslaved, the toll was unbearable. They began to understand what was happening, though few dared to name it aloud. The children with green eyes and pale skin were living proof of her crimes. They moved between the house and the fields like ghosts caught between 2 worlds, favored but hated, privileged but enslaved. Some of the men forced into her program carried the weight of knowing their own children were locked inside the house they built. One man, Thomas, refused to comply. Katherine had him flogged in front of everyone, 39 lashes that carved her authority into his back. Then, bleeding and broken, he was still dragged to the main house to fulfill her order. That night, no one slept in the quarters. The screams echoed long after the house went dark. Yet for all her cruelty, Katherine saw herself not as a villain, but as a reformer. In her mind, Thornhill was a model for the future, a plantation immune to rebellion or debt, where labor and lineage were one. Family loyalty, she wrote in her journal, is the most efficient form of control. What she couldn't see was that loyalty built through terror can never endure. Beneath her house, Resentment smoldered like an ember waiting for wind. And as the 1850s drew to a close, the winds of change were already rising across Georgia. The nation was splintering, and the very system that had protected her was beginning to crumble. Katherine Thornhill had perfected her breeding ground, but the seeds she had sown were about to grow into something she could no longer contain. By the end of the 1850s, Thornhill Estate was no longer merely a plantation. It had become a living archive of Katherine Thornhill's obsession. She had transformed one of the mansion's unused wings into what she called the Heritage Room, a private sanctum that few ever saw and none spoke of. From the outside, it appeared like any other locked storage chamber, but inside, its air was thick with the scent of lamp oil, ink, and decay. The walls were lined with shelves containing leather-bound journals, small glass vials filled with locks of hair, and meticulously drawn charts that looked eerily like breeding diagrams. Each strand of hair was labeled with a name, a date, and a note about temperament or constitution. To Katherine, these weren't trophies. They were proof of her genius, evidence of a dynasty engineered by her own hand. She spent hours in that room charting the lineage of every child born on Thornhill land. Her handwriting filled hundreds of pages with cold precision, planned pairings, projected traits, notes about height, endurance, and even intelligence. She told herself she was perfecting creation, that God had given her intellect where men had given her weakness. In her eyes, she wasn't defying morality, she was improving upon it. If anyone questioned how her workforce seemed to multiply without purchase, she would smile demurely and speak of God's providence and the natural blessings of the land. No one pried further. In a world already steeped in cruelty, Katherine's evil passed as efficiency. But behind her careful facade, the walls of Thornhill were beginning to tremble. The enslaved people knew what was happening now. Every pairing, every birth, every disappearance. Mothers whispered prayers over newborns whose skin was too light, whose eyes mirrored the mistress's own. Some refused to speak at all, their grief sealed behind silence. Yet even within that terror, quiet resistance took root. The people in the quarters began to remember who they were before Thornhill, before Katherine. They passed songs at night, taught forbidden words to their children, and guarded fragments of stories that would one day outlive their oppressor. Katherine sensed this change, this slow drift away from obedience, and it terrified her. Her control depended on faith, in her system, in the lie that this was destiny. Without that belief, her family would unravel. So she tightened her grip. She separated families she feared might influence her children. She demanded reports on conversations overheard in the quarters, and still she returned to her heritage room night after night, surrounded by her records like a queen among relics, convincing herself she was building something eternal. In those flickering lamplights, her madness became indistinguishable from faith. Each mark of ink was a prayer to a future she believed she could control. But history was closing in. The 1860 election loomed. The country stood at the edge of civil war, and even as Katherine sketched out her next generation of pairings, the world beyond Thornhill was preparing to tear hers apart. When war finally erupted in 1861, the first cannon fire at Fort Sumter seemed distant from the quiet red fields of Burke County. But like thunder crawling down from a far-off storm, its echoes soon reached Thornhill. The South was unraveling, and even Katherine Thornhill could feel it. Her overseer, Virgil Kane, left to fight for the Confederacy that spring, leaving the plantation under the weak supervision of an aging man named Silas Kendrick. With the younger white men gone to war, the balance of power on the estate began to shift. Katherine tried to maintain order, rationing supplies, reinforcing curfews, and forbidding anyone to leave the property, but the old fears were fading. In whispers and glances, the enslaved population began to sense it. The mistress's control was no longer absolute. Rumors trickled in through traders, travelers, and even Confederate soldiers demanding food or horses. They spoke of President Lincoln, of Union victories in the West, of enslaved people who had fled plantations and joined the Union Army. Katherine pretended not to hear, but she saw it in their eyes, the spark she'd spent 16 years trying to extinguish. Her special children, now teenagers, were growing restless too. Jonathan, her eldest, stood nearly as tall as his late father and had begun to ask questions she couldn't answer. The others whispered among themselves, repeating snatches of things they'd overheard from the quarters. The old system of silence was fracturing. Katherine responded the only way she knew how, by tightening control. She paired her children with young enslaved partners earlier than planned, disguising these forced matings as marriages. Jonathan, just 15, was wed to a 16-year-old girl named Rachel. He didn't know she was enslaved by law, nor did he understand the full horror of his mother's intentions. Outside Thornhill's gates, Georgia was bleeding. The war had drained the South of men and money. Supplies dwindled, crops rotted in the fields, and the Confederate dream of victory dimmed with each passing year. But inside the plantation house, Katherine clung to her delusions of legacy. She called her children the future of Thornhill and filled her journals with new entries about pairings, births, and lineages yet to come. The war, to her, was an inconvenience, a storm that would pass while her family endured. What she didn't see was that the same chaos that threatened the Confederacy was spreading through her home. Hope was a dangerous contagion, and it had begun to take root in the hearts of those she had enslaved. By 1863, the tide had turned. Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. For the people trapped on Thornhill Estate, each rumor of defeat carried with it a tremor of anticipation. The mistress could feel the walls closing in. Her eyes, once cold and certain, now darted nervously at every sound in the night. Her heritage was unraveling. Children who no longer obeyed, workers who whispered of freedom, and a war that was erasing the world that had enabled her cruelty. But instead of yielding, Katherine Thornhill made a fatal choice. She decided that if the old world was ending, she would rather burn with it than live in the new one. By March of 1864, the storm that had been gathering for years finally broke over Thornhill Estate. The war was closing in on Georgia. Sherman's armies advancing from the west, Confederate soldiers retreating through burned-out fields, and Katherine Thornhill knew that everything she'd built was about to crumble. Her journals were filled with frantic entries: Union forces approaching Savannah, rumors of emancipation spreading, must secure the legacy before it is lost. That legacy wasn't her land or her fortune. It was her children, the proof of her experiment. She believed that if the North won, freedom would destroy her life's work. So, on a night thick with the scent of rain and gunpowder, she gathered all 11 of her biological children in the East Wing, the same wing that held the Heritage Room, and locked the doors behind them. Her voice trembled, though she masked it with calm. "The Yankees are coming," she said, clutching her coded journals to her chest. "They will take everything from us. Your home, your name, your purpose. I won't let them." She opened a small wooden box on the table, revealing several glass bottles filled with a clear, opiate-laced liquid. "This medicine will keep us together," she whispered. "Forever." The older children froze in horror. Abigail began to cry. Eleanora stepped forward. "You want to kill us?" she said quietly. Katherine shook her head. "I want to save you. You'll never belong in their world. Too white for one, too black for the other. Out there, you'll be nothing. Here, you're everything." But Jonathan, her eldest, her first creation, moved between her and the others. "No," he said, "not anymore." His voice cracked, but his resolve did not. "You're not saving us. You're trying to erase what you did." Katherine's mask slipped, Years of control, calculation, and pride erupted into fury. She slapped Jonathan hard across the face, her eyes wild. "Ungrateful child, I gave you life. I gave you purpose." Eleanora stepped beside her brother, trembling but firm. "You gave us chains," she said, "and now you're afraid we'll break them." For a moment the room fell silent. Just the hiss of the lamps and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Then, in one desperate motion, Katherine snatched the journals and vials from the table and fled into the storm. Jonathan and Eleanora chased her through the house, down the porch steps, and across the muddy yard toward the quarters. What happened next became legend. Some said she screamed scripture as she ran. Others said she laughed, clutching her records like holy relics. But by the time her children reached the cabins, the enslaved people had already surrounded her. No one spoke of exactly how it happened. Some claimed the women led her toward the old well near the edge of the property. Others said she was struck down before she could cry out. The next morning, the house was silent. The heritage room lay in ruins, its papers burned, its vials shattered, its walls smeared with soot. Katherine Thornhill had vanished, and none of the freed people who remained ever revealed where she'd gone. The official story would later say she fled the approaching Union Army, but everyone who'd lived through her rule knew the truth. The mistress who believed she could breed loyalty had met justice at the hands of those she tried to own. And in that night of fire and blood, Thornhill Estate finally changed hands, from the grip of a single woman's madness to the quiet defiance of the people she had once called property. When dawn rose over Thornhill Estate the morning after Katherine's disappearance, the mist hung low across the red fields, wrapping everything in silence. The great house stood half-charred, its windows shattered, its walls scorched from the fires that had burned through the night. But beneath that ruin, there was peace, the kind that follows only after years of torment. The enslaved people gathered outside the quarters, uncertain what to do now that the source of their terror was gone. Eleanora and Jonathan stood apart, staring at the place where their mother had vanished. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. For the first time in their lives, the air felt free. And yet, freedom born from blood left a weight that would never fully lift. The nightmare was over, but the question of what to do next had only begun. In the months that followed, Union troops reached Burke County. Among them was Captain Samuel Reynolds of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, who recorded in his report the discovery of a property known as Thornhill Estate, exhibiting evidence of systematic breeding among enslaved persons. He wrote that 23 children were found locked in the basement, all bearing the same peculiar features: green eyes, auburn hair, pale skin. They were freed and placed with freedmen families in the area, but their origins remained largely unspoken. When asked what had become of their mistress, the survivors said only, "She's gone." And that was enough. The Union soldiers burned the remaining fields, dismantled the iron gates, and left the plantation to rot. Thornhill, once Katherine's twisted kingdom, was swallowed by weeds and time. After emancipation, life scattered like ashes on the wind. Most of those who had been enslaved at Thornhill fled north or to nearby towns, desperate to reclaim fragments of the families Katherine had torn apart. Some, like Eleanora's father, Thomas, stayed long enough to bury the past in silence. Eleanora herself remained for 2 years, working the land she had been born to serve, perhaps out of obligation, perhaps out of defiance. In 1867, she finally left for Savannah, where she lived quietly as a seamstress. She married but never had children. Her brother Jonathan tried to rebuild the estate, clinging to the ghost of normalcy, but the soil was dead and the community shunned the land as cursed. He left Georgia in 1869, changing his name, running from a history that could never be outrun. Both siblings carried the same truth to their graves, that their bloodline was both victim and evidence, salvation and sin. Decades later, long after the war and Reconstruction had faded into history, Thornhill's story resurfaced. A well digger in 1871 unearthed the skeletal remains of a woman buried deep underground, her skull fractured, a corroded locket still hanging from her neck. The coroner called her unknown female. But in Burke County, everyone knew. It was the Mistress of Thornhill, finally exhumed from the earth she had poisoned. And still, her story didn't end there. In the whispers of the Black community, in the DNA of descendants who never knew their origins, her legacy lived on, a warning carved into bloodlines and memory. Today, no monument stands on the land where Thornhill once rose. Only trees and silence remain. But beneath that soil lies the truth of what power, pride, and fear can do when left unchecked, and the unyielding strength of those who survived it. Because history does not forget, it waits, buried, until someone dares to dig again.